got an independent funder's view even when I worked for the Arts Council, but I describe myself as a recovering funder. I'll just say a little bit about myself before I start, just so that just to put a bit of flesh on that. The funding bit, I joined Northern Arts, as was the Regional Arts Board, in 2000 as a head of department, and then when Arts Council England kind of took over the Regional Arts Board and merged them together, I moved into Arts Council England in the North East and became the executive director and part of the national exec team for Arts Council England in 2005, and left in 2010, so some time ago now actually, in arts funding and policy terms. And that 10 years was a kind of big time of change in the North East. I already flushed out that Yvonne is from Stockton, which was originally, which is nice. But you know, big capital developments and organisational development. So it did throw up some learning experiences around governance. So I'm going to talk a little bit kind of Chatham House rules, if that's okay with people, not to go into particular instances, but you know, it would probably be better if you didn't quote me personally or anything. From that experience, because actually it's quite a hard thing being a funder in that situation. Prior to that, I worked in the arts, and I've run organisations and worked to and with boards as a director, not a board director, but as the person with the job title of director. It was too small an organisation to be called the chief executive. I suspect. And since then, I worked for myself, essentially. Thinking practice is the working name, because Mark Robinson is, as I've said on many occasions, is a rubbish name in the age of Google. No one can find you, because that's pretty common. And I took, when I left the Arts Council, I took the opportunity to join some boards. Not as many as people asked, which kind of I took as a vote of confidence that people asked me to be on their boards. So I'm actually on 3, which is probably one too many, to be honest, certainly at times. So I'm on the board of the organisation which runs the AV Festival, which is a biannual digital and visual arts festival. I'm the vice chair of 7 Stories, which is the National Centre for Children's Books. So a building-based, you know, kind of museum, visitor centre with a collection and all sorts of things. And I'm the chair of a tiny organisation called the Swallows Foundation, which goes from project funding to project funding, connects artists in the North East with artists in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. So each of those is quite a different experience of governance, actually, because they're very different sorts of boards. So I'm going to draw a little bit on that experience as well. But I think this is, get this the right way. Before I start talking, just to ask a few questions. I think I might have pieced together some of these answers from things that people have said, but I just want you to sort of do a bit of a show of hands to these questions. How many people here see themselves as cultural leaders? Okay, some confident people, some quite sure. How many do what you do under the governance of others? At least part of the time. So, yeah, so about. Yeah. How many feel that the things they do in their working life would be very different if, for those 5 who said you did that, if you weren't under the supervision and governance of others, would your working life be very different? And equally, the same question to those who aren't. If you had a board or some kind of governance, would it be very different? Or would you be doing the same things you do anyway? Anyone be working differently? No. Okay, that's interesting. all the effort that goes into governance, and you'd be doing the same stuff if they weren't there, or if they were. And how many people have got a governance role as well as your day jobs? So we've got probably more than half of people have got that. So you're doing both. And then the last question is, how many live your governance lives where you live your work life?
50-50.
Do you live your governor's life? Do you do your governor's work with all the same things that you bring to your work life? Yeah. Right. Okay. Just to put those questions into your brain in a way before we kind of move on. Miles asked me to talk, I think, or at least I'm going to pretend, because of that funders perspective. But I've also, since I left the Arts Council, I've written a couple of papers to do with the resilience of organisations, and leadership and governance is one of 8 characteristics which I kind of identified in that as something that gives an organisation the ability, the chance to be both adaptive, so to change depending on what happens in the world around it, and resilient when things happen, as they good things and bad things will happen. The description of what that looks like talks about a lot of things which you kind of touched on this morning. So the organisation has leadership which provides clarity internally and externally, so people know who you are and what you're doing, and there's a kind of match between what the people inside the organisation think they're doing and what the people outside the organisation, when they look at you, think. You've got decision making that's aligned to your business model. So if your business model is reliant on income from box office, you've got decision making that supports that being appropriate rather than sending you off somewhere else. Constantly seeking improvement and future focused whilst delivering current plans. Addresses key issues with appropriate levels of challenge and support. You could pause that a little bit. Addresses the key issues. So, the mythical board that spends an hour of the 2 hours talking about the toilets and the catering may or may not be addressing the key issues. It may be the key issues occasionally. Clear roles and responsibilities, able to flex to circumstances, clear, challenging and supportive management and reporting systems in place. And for me, that characteristic is both about the exec leadership and the governance. Those things need to be at both levels. One of the things that I've kind of noticed working with that framework with organisations, one of the other things I talk about is the importance of networks for resilience. So if you're tied into lots of networks, that will tend to make you more able to change, more able to draw on different influences. But if you've got a problem, you've also got more people to call on. It's kind of common sense way of looking at it. But also, I talk about the internal networks, particularly in bigger organisations, where if silos start to develop, that can be a problem. And I didn't really clock this, I think, when I did the first set of work, first set of research around this, but even in small organisations, one of the two most important silos that can build up is between the staff and the board. So the board and the staff as silos was something that I kind of clocked when I was working with a couple of organisations. Breaking that down really, really helps with a lot of the kinds of issues that we've been talking about, actually. So I'm going to relate some of the things that I say to that adaptive resilience framework as well, but without kind of focusing entirely on that. I'm a binary person normally, but I decided to push myself, so I like to, I think it's because I'm a Libra, but I like to have 2s, or, and as a consultant I also like 2x2s. Those of you who work freelance for nature. But I'm going to talk about triangles today. So this might go horribly wrong, because it feels slightly counterintuitive to me, going with triangles. But I'm going to throw a few triangles up to some of which may connect to what you want to talk about later, and some not to do with governance. So, firstly, thinking about this thing of what do funders want from governance. The first one, I think there's I'll say a little bit about each of these points. I think funders look to governance for some reassurance. They look for reassurance that you're legal and that you're keeping on the straight and narrow. They look for reassurance that there's something to fall back on if the chief exec falls under a bus or something happens like that. They look for the reassurance of hoping that nothing's going to turn out embarrassing to the funder. Because funders don't like to be embarrassed by their clients doing something daft. There's that kind of first do no harm sort of principle in a way that I think governance provides to a funder. And I think that's where, I'm not necessarily suggesting all of these things are good things, or the right things, or even things that funders would necessarily admit to explicitly, but I do think that that's one of the things that boards are giving to funders, and it's worth thinking about how you do that in a way that's honest and authentic to you. I think most funders have moved on from that absolutely requiring that you have a board of a certain size and scale and nature, and being a charity and so on. But there's still some of that frame in their thinking. I think they look to boards to provide connectivity beyond the staff. So the funders will look to often to the team sheet of a board rather than the actual performance. How does this add to the professional expertise that the organisation has got? Because even in a big organisation, you are limited, in inverted commas, by the professional expertise of having to run an art centre or a gallery or an opera house. And that might not bring you into all the networks that could be useful to you. So they're looking for how you can, how the governance extends the network of the organisation. And then I struggled to find the right phrase to put here. But they want someone else to talk to occasionally, other than the staff. So that might be about the long-term visions of the organisations. It might be if there's a problem and they're not getting anywhere with the chief exec, they want to talk to the governance level. Just as in the same way that if they think the governance isn't quite working, they might talk to the chief exec about how they're going to develop their board. So I think there's a dual thing going on there. There's a sort of relationship between that one and that one if things go wrong, because they've got someone else to blame when work isn't going quite right. I'm just looking at my notes. All of that is about leads you to what is the governance doing for you? But I wanted to start with that kind of immediate level of funder description. And if the funder looks at an organisation and can't see that there's a governance structure that's delivering some of that, as well as the basics of good governance, which I'll come on to talk to, that's when they start to get a bit twitchy, in my experience, and start to want to interfere or tweak or ask you to do that. Framework 2 is one that I've borrowed from what I think is a really good book about governance. And it's been bubbling under in the conversation this morning. It's called it's called Governance as Leadership. I don't know whether anyone's read that. It's by some American, I think, consultants called Richard Chait, William Ryan, and Barbara Taylor. And it's sort of, it tries to, their analysis is that part of the problem with governance is that nobody talks about governance as leadership. If you think of, there's obviously lots of fellows here and connected people here today, you think of all the discourse that we've had around cultural leadership in recent years, which has not been at the managerial roles and responsibilities level. It's been at a much more, it's been at a higher level of thinking, a higher, greater complexity of thinking actually. Whereas the governance training, which we've had, has tended to be more checklist based, more roles and responsibilities, more, if you stick to this job description, the governance will get better. Whereas I'm pretty sure that nobody went into one of the core fellows sessions and went, if you deliver your job description, you will be a good cultural leader. And whoever met some, if people start talking about their job descriptions at work, you generally get a bit worried. There's generally a problem somewhere in my experience if people say, I've been looking at my job description. That's not a sign that they're about to make some great breakthrough. So the Ryan and Taylor's argument is actually we need to shift the conversation about governance out of a technical one, or out of merely a technical one. So they have a triangle which to do with 3 modes of governance. So fiduciary, which is the what's kept in trust. That's the, are you looking after the money? Are you looking after the building? Are you looking after the purpose of the organisation as well? Tends to be quite technical, quite legalistic. So that would have questions like, are we sure we can do this?
What does it say?
Fiduciary. Which is one of those words that when people want to scare you about governance, they use, because it sounds, because it's Latin, presumably.
Right.
I used to think that was just to do with money, but it's not. It's actually to do with, it must have the same root as fidelity. So it's to do with trust.
It's stewardship.
Yeah, so it's about the board as the stewards of purpose, money, assets, staff, those sorts of things. But it can lead to what they call the mode 1, which is looking after, have we got a grip on this? So that's where you give the chief executive a hard time because they're not hitting the income targets. And it's how are you going to turn that around, rather than a conversation about the value of what's being done through that. That's not to say that that isn't necessary, but it's not. That's not the only mode, is the argument. Second mode, they talk about strategic leadership. So that's about direction. It's about how you're going to achieve your mission. Those sorts of topics. And for me, that's best done. That works best when you can see that there's a partnership between, people talk about the relationship between the chief exec and the chair as being crucial, but it's actually broader than that. It's about the organisation and the board going forward together. So I know in my work now, if somebody says we want to have a board away day, but we don't want the staff there, or we only want the chief exec there, there might be good reasons for that sometimes, but equally it can be a little bit of a flag to question for me. And I think a lot of boards, I'll look at this book, and I think in my experience I can see that boards are pretty, reasonable. They know how to do some of that stuff at the basic level. You can do the strategic stuff at the basic level by, we all have to have a business plan. We will review the aims, the objectives, and we go through that. You can go through that mechanistically rather than creatively. And the third is what they call, third point of this triangle, is what they call generative governance, which is much more the, what are we doing here? What is the purpose of this organisation? What should it be in the next phase? A much more open kind of conversation, a more creative conversation. Where those, particularly I think in the arts, you get this tension between who are you serving? Are you serving the artistic director? Are you serving the community or the audiences? Are you serving your audiences or those people who don't yet come to you? Those kinds of things. Where you could be having most boards could be having a much richer conversation about that. And they could be having a more collaborative conversation with each other about that, both within individual boards, but boards talking to each other, you know, of different organisations, whether that's in an art form or a place. I think what that leads to is that you start to see governance not so much as a kind of control thing between who's got control here, the exec or the non-exec, but as a collaboration. You know, that question of leadership that came up this morning was one that I was going to flag anyway, but who's leading whom? Well, actually, if you take that away, if you turn that from being a control issue to, it's an image that gets used in all the contexts in it, but if you start to think of it as a dance, where actually you move the control, you move the leadership between you at different times, so that you're having fun and you're doing what you want to, and you start to see governance as a collaboration between staff and board. That's where I've always observed that as the best, most productive. Another quick triangle. I'm going to throw these out and then we will do something we've done. Is to do with time. Because I think one of the things that I talk about in the resilience work, for me the centre of the stuff I've done around resilience is to do with shared purpose. Does this organisation know who it is and what it's for? Because actually, even if it's got a great big building, or a stack of money in the bank, or a fantastic staff team, if it's unclear about that, everything else wobbles. And if you've got that as your centre point, even if you lose your chief exec or your building burns down, you can go back to it. You can go and constantly kind of refreshing that is key. And I talk about the importance of organisational memory in that, as well as the kind of performance monitoring stuff. So I think funders look to boards to be able to go now, or actually in reality it's the last 3 months is generally what they look at, or the last reporting period. But where are we now? What's going on? And if people can't, as soon as you can't describe that, certainly funders and probably young people will get a bit nervous. So if you ask the chair or somebody on a board and they go, how are the ticket sales going, and their information is old, that makes me twitchy. And where I've seen problems in organisations, financial problems, it's often where people have taken their eye off the ball on that one for some reason, either because they assume it's all right, or because they're more focused on this one sometimes, tomorrow. But you do want a board to have a view of the future. I think a board, in collaboration with the staff, needs to be able to tell that story of what the organisation is doing. And for me, that's actually sometimes more powerful than the aims, objectives, goals, smart targets kind of plan for the governance role, because it's about, this is where we're going, this is what we're trying to achieve on our mission. You need that plan, but that's more at the operational level. So you want a board that's not so obsessed with ticket sales and bar income that it can't think about what's happening in an art form, say.
Is this not just strategy?
I think it informs strategy, but I think for me it's also about purpose and identity. That might change over time. For me, I think there's a distinction between the strategy of an organisation and the purpose and identity of an organisation. Strategy is how you express it, probably the simplest way of putting it. But a board should also bring some memory to the organisation, I think. And that's one of the areas where I think I personally slightly diverge from some of the orthodoxies to do with turnover of board membership, which in general has tended to get shorter as a time span. If you look at some of the guidance, it might say 2-3 year terms, 2-5 years. If you think of an organisation of any scale going through a big development, if you're going through a capital development, 6 years is nothing. And I think you can sometimes lose that. You don't want everybody there for 10 or 12 years, so you need a bit of a mix. But I think having some continuity through the board is quite important. And making sure that the board pass on that organisational memory to the new people. And actually that for me is more important than how we do subcommittees and that kind of induction. And it's very informal, that. That's not to say that it should become this is how we do things around here kind of orthodoxy, but having some organisational memory to inform that is for me pretty important. Okay. So, I'm going to pause there with the triangles. One of the things that, as a funder, I noticed a lot was, and I think it was flagged in the kind of running order, was this thing that the team sheet doesn't equal the performance. A lot of funders take, at times, they'll look down and they go, private sector, lawyer, accountant, artist, they've sort of got a checklist. Or you look at it and you go, yeah, really great people, they run multi-million-pound businesses, and then there's this big action. It just doesn't work somehow. And I saw that on a number of occasions. The conclusion that I came to was it was about motivation. It was about people being motivated to work well. And what makes people perform well is stretching tasks that draw on their expertise but push them forward, things that we're learning from, things that excite us, things that bring us something new, things that allow us to display our skills, that sort of thing. And in general, when we think about the tasks that we ask our boards to do, too often I think we ask them to do things which are dull, that feel like jobs that have to be done, things that don't allow them to display their skills, which is why often people do them they either do them in a cursory way, the nodding through of accounts, or they kind of default to hobby horses, or they default to roles. It's something I've observed on the board, and the rest of the board defaults to boards as well. So nobody will ask the question about finance apart from Joanne, the accountant, and nobody else is going to ask about the contracts other than Michael, the lawyer. That sort of thing, rather than it all being a kind of a team game, actually. But for me, it comes back to that: are we giving them the chance to? And they're getting stuck in that mode one, in that fiduciary role often, where we can tick the boxes that we've done this. It's within the bounds of play. Whereas actually the strategic and generative bits is where we get most excitement. And that's what gives people the chance to work. And that's why often I think board members, again in my experience, enjoy subgroups more than they do the boards sometimes, depending on the nature of the subgroup. I'm not necessarily saying that about the audit committee, but some people love auditing. You need some people who love auditing. But because they like it gives them something to get their teeth into. It's the kind of phrase that you would hear. And I often think, how do we bring that all back together? Because when you break into the subgroups, and then you kind of get the 3 bullet points that came out of that subgroup,
somehow you're missing the spark in the whole group. So it never sometimes doesn't quite turn into first class performance, even though the team is working well. So in general, I think the thing I've written down here is checklists are death to active listening. It seems to me that, again, dance was one metaphor that I used, but conversation is another one about boards. But conversation is about listening as well as talking. If I think of boards that I've observed or been on where they've not been catching fire, it's because we don't listen. I think of management teams as well. Actually, it's the same paradigm. It's a leadership thing, probably, that we're waiting for our turn to speak rather than really listening. And I think cultivating that within the board is really important. But when we're thinking tick, done that, we're not listening. The agenda almost encourages that. Where are we on the agenda? How many of them are crossed off? Unless that's just me. Crosses out items off. I do think that standard agendas are really dangerous for boards. Standing items, because the standing item, you immediately shut down at least part of your attention, unless it's something you're worried about. Linked to that listening thing is that I think boards should be learning environments for members, and that's often why people are performing at the same height that they will be in their day jobs, because they're not learning.
Can you go there, Mark?
All right, thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good luck. Bye.
And I think that's really important, because I think in terms of the recruitment, it sounds as if it's similar here to what we're having in England, but training budgets are, which is my hobby horse at board meetings generally, training budgets too small. And they go, yeah, we know. But training budgets are shrinking under financial pressure, but actually allowing people bits of time to be board members if they're doing it well and in the right places, suitable places for them, could be a huge professional development for staff of all sorts, actually, in that. But you've got to make it the right space to do that. Okay. Oh, I've got a triangle of three things, therefore, that it's not about. So it's not about the job description. For me, I think you want to have clear roles, but if you obsess about them, I think that becomes a self-defeating, kind of a self-limiting thing. It's not about your day job title. It's about how you work at best. So the fact that you're the chief exec of Smith and Sons lawyers isn't necessarily a good thing. It might be that you want somebody else with those skills. And it's not about just checking things. It's not about supervision. I'm just reading my notes. So I'll end with another triangle. I'll end this bit with another triangle, which goes back to this purpose point of things that it is about. I'll end with a negative. I mentioned this earlier, but for me, there is something about the board setting, shaping, collaboratively working with their staff to constantly redefine that vision, mission, purpose. I think in any good organisation, you cannot separate out the leadership, the executive leadership, from the governance leadership in that without running certain risks of disaffection and disconnection. And I think boards should absolutely, this is one of the, it's kind of rare, I think, in my experience as a funder, it always kind of raises a question in funders' heads when the chief exec is actually a member of the board, is a director. But in some ways, I think it's actually quite a good thing when they're bound in like that. I know there are certain circumstances where that probably isn't the case for good reasons, but that separation that in theory the board tells the chief exec what to do doesn't help with the richness of this. It creates an extra kind of difficulty in managing it. Having the chief exec as a member of the board perhaps gives him a kind of different position, a less subservient position to the governance level, which creates a better connection between the staff and the board. Might have views about that. I do think the board is a constituency, but it has to represent that constituency. So I'm in an interesting conversation over coffee about borders between Wales and England. But actually, I think if you think of boards, I really wasn't heading towards this pun, but boards as borders between inside and outside. Is a board inside an organisation or is it outside? Well, it's kind of both in a way from the day-to-day running. So it can represent the organisation to the outside world, that classic thing that we want board members who are advocates, but you also want board members who are advocates for artists, audiences, communities, whatever your constituency happens to be, into the board conversation. And if you lose that connection, that's again one of the things that as a funder will start to make it a bit twitchy. And then the last one here, which sort of relates to that, but I think it's slightly different, is situation. One of the things I talk about in the resilience things that I've written about is this notion of situation awareness. Do you know what's going on? What's going on in your local authority, what's going on in your art form, what's going on with the audiences, that sort of thing. And boards can be a really important thing for that, because it's that diversity perspective that they bring alongside the staff. I do think it's alongside the staff, ideally, because I think because of the nature of the kinds of people that tend to be on boards, they're not necessarily as diverse as when you add the staff in, or the views of all the staff represented by the management who might be there. But making sure that you're aware, the organisation is aware of the situation, and that these things are all impacting upon each other. Because I suspect these triangles could get very deformed. If you get weak on one area, it will end up being flat. In a way that I can't draw. The only other thing I was going to say, which was just drawing on something from earlier in the morning, was the thing about control and supervision. Supervision? It's not quite the right word. Can't find the right word right now. But from a funder's point of view, where do funders sit? Who regulates governance? Who governs the government? The governors was the question that we were talking about earlier. And funders have a particular role in that, which in my experience could be quite a frustrating one, as with executive performance actually. As a funder, as a good funder, you shouldn't be throwing your weight around, intervening crudely, getting rid of people because they're not delivering. But what do you do when a board of an organisation just isn't getting it, isn't tackling an issue, it's got a problem but doesn't think it's a problem, it's got an opportunity but doesn't think it's an opportunity, is weak in some way? How do you intervene in that? I remember having a bit of an argument with Anthony Gormley once about this. who wanted me to intervene in something.
Yeah.
Well, he was a bloody board member. And I was going, you're the board member, you intervene. And this does absolutely Chatham House rules. But, and it was very tricky, because once you start, as a funder, once you start to go, actually, I'm intervening here, you could very, it could be like the whack-a-mole game. In marriage, one pops up there. And it's not, doesn't create the right kind of relationship that you want. Equally, you can be very vulnerable to criticism that says you stood by and did nothing. And I don't have an answer to that, really, other than that it's one for boards to think, what's my responsibility in that situation, for each individual board member, actually. As I think that sort of the questions I was asking earlier, is there's something about board members taking responsibility for their own performance in the way that they do when they do their day jobs could make a huge shift in the collective performance of boards, I think. Because I know I don't always do that. If I'm perfectly honest, I think there are board meetings I've turned up to over the years where I've coasted in the way that I wouldn't in my day job. You know, I've gone to make the numbers up sometimes. And that could be fine on a practical level, but it doesn't lead to the kind of performance that we really need, I think. So on that confession, I'm going to pause there for kind of questions, but I've got a little activity I want to do before we break, if that's okay. But maybe I've chucked a lot of stuff that you might be going, no!
I just wanted to make an observation on the who governs the governance. I think it's probably a product of the multiple restructures that have gone on in both arts councils that fund us, but I think the level of expertise and practical experience of the observer at the board meeting has reduced quite significantly over the last 10 years or so. And that's quite a big issue for a large organisation, particularly.
Yeah, I think, like, from the English perspective, I absolutely agree with that. And I think it is a particular issue for organisations as big as yourselves. I know that's been an issue in England. Yeah, that role of observer is a really interesting one, isn't it? What does that mean in practice, being an observer? Just reporting back to base that they
were all there.
Yeah.
I think that relationship is, I mean, what you finished on for me is really pertinent, and I think it is about how the relationship between, client, organisation and funder is, I think in Wales, certainly from my perspective, and I can only talk from kind of my Arts Council members hat, it needs to shift. For a long time it was in this kind of parent-child relationship, and I think we've moved forward from that certainly, but there is this kind of, and for some organisations, that case of looking to the front, and what is that relationship and how does it work? If an observer comes to the meeting, what's that relationship really about? Is everybody saying, well, the Arts Council person's coming this week, so we've got to, So what is that relationship? How do you change that? How do you move it forwards? And I think it can be so frustrating from a funding perspective in terms of, one of the reasons Arts Council Wales has kind of looked at this development programme and governance is because when we did our big investment review, it's one of the things that, we saw different things, some from a fiduciary kind of aspect, some, generous just sort of said, well, there's a few things that aren't quite what we would like them to be, and we were doing a lot of work on our own governance, and kind of like, well, what can we do? We can do a development programme, we can try and get people to engage and have that conversation. I have to say it wasn't particularly well taken up. Perhaps that says something about that thing about whether or not people felt they needed to be there. But we've been dealing with some sticky governance issues, and it is difficult. People saying to you, well, you need to intervene in this, and actually, well, we can't. That's the board. They need to sort it out, and that becomes a very difficult situation to manage. And how you talk to the rest of your constituency, so the other clients and everybody else, and you manage that reputation, you manage all that kind of thing, but not being embarrassed. But how you talk about that is just as important, I think, in terms of how you move the conversation about governance forwards, and that's the difficult thing.
But I think when you have an observer from the funding body in attendance, that expect to be able to ask that person something.
Yeah, of course.
And get an answer that's based on some expertise. And I'm not particularly thinking of Wales here, but we've had a project running in England for the last almost 2 years. A sort of wide analysis of the opera and ballet sectors. And at times the observer through our meetings from ACE has not been able to answer a question from the board chair or a board member about that process.
I think it is frustrating, and I think it's important that if we are going to move things forward, you have to have a relationship at the level, that's appropriate for what you're doing. Because that's the other thing is, like, you were saying, well, sometimes you'll look down the checklist and you go, all these people are here and all the policies in place and all the frameworks there, brilliant, yeah, fantastic governance. But actually, you go to the board meeting and you go, oh, God, what's going on? How can this, because it is about people and the culture of that board and what's going on. So you need to be able to have that level that's appropriate to kind of where you're at and the level that you're,
I've always found it useful having someone from the Arts Council as observer, because they can give a sector vision when people get bogged down into what's happening in their own little corner. That it's useful from a comparative point of view.
It was interesting with the Scottish Arts Council, when I did work there a while back with Graham Berry, it was almost stopped, full stop, any Arts Council officer, even observing board members, board meetings. He said the propensity for shadow directors to be in place there, with all of the board going, what do you think we should do with that to Arts Council, was just what you were talking about there in terms of the parent-child responsibility with it. And then the organisation could quite legitimately say, it wasn't our fault, it was Arts Council's view that we did this. And it was just like shifting the monkey of any problems onto the funder and said, our success or failure is directly laid at your feet. It's nothing to do with us, it's you with it. And so, Graham Berry at the time, when he was chief exec of the Scottish Arts Council, just said, we stopped it.
we don't do it.
And actually all the officers said, thank God for that, we can free up a bit more of our time now, we can do this and that, all that sort of stuff. But it is really interesting that pull from organisations, please come on to be observers, come and observe our meetings, we need your input and all that sort of stuff, help us to the, if we do that, we'll take the monkey off your shoulders onto ours. Was that familiar?
Yeah, no, that's very familiar.
And just, Emma, in terms of it, is there anything, before you go into your exercise, Mark, is there anything you wanted to either confirm, add,
Well, I wouldn't disagree
take
with
issue with?
what Mark said. I mean, I think I've said, in terms of where we're going, you kind of want to move that forward, and I think Arts Council Wales is keen to, move that conversation and to do the training of governance. But I think the difficulty that we've had with the recent programme is a lack of take-up. Now, I can't put words in Cass's mouth, and I don't know, what the barriers to that are. And I think that's something that we need to work out, whether or not it is a case of people think that they don't. I mean, my intuition is that people think that they don't need the training. Our board's fine, but actually, perhaps there are other things. But
also, what signal do you send when you do go? It's
Yeah,
like, my board's not fine. I mean, there's all sorts of
exactly.
things there that I think
Well,
are
that is, I mean,
psychological.
would not have been,
elements to it.
it's something different here as well. I mean, both the boards I work, my organisation and the board, they're neither an NPO or an RFO.
Yeah.
Getting any kind of conversation with somebody from the Arts Council is, quite tricky at all. So the idea you actually might get somebody coming to a board meeting is like, as I said. When you ran the governance program before, was that open to all organisations? Or?
I think it was just for RFOs at this stage, with a view to roll it out later on, because that's the part of the portfolio that we were dealing with.
But you see, that is a problem, isn't it? Because if you don't have that open accessibility, and how do you get the conversations between different kinds of organisations? That's probably why Kate and I, we're together, because we work together, and we were saying we both, from very different spectrums, how the organisations came apart, but actually we're serving constituency and purposes in common.
And given the point that you made earlier, which is that board members will move around over their lifetime, between different organisations.
Yeah.
That kind of makes some sense. Yeah. The thing, Kath had shared a very sort of high-level evaluation thing, I think, with Miles, which he shared with me last night. The thing that did strike me was how many people had scored themselves 10 out of 10 to start with.
Yeah, exactly.
Which suggests, and actually, generally, I'd say a good training session should make them realise that they weren't 10 out of 10.
They were 3.
Well, whatever, but...
Yeah. We took part in the Charity Commission Wales survey of governance, where so I had all my board members and myself, we all voted as our governance. It was really, really diverse. There wasn't not agreement at all, which that has been the whole basis of our governance programme now,
Yeah.
is to change that. But it's true that some people just think, oh, it was almost like, oh, marvellous, yes, of course, and that isn't, clearly it's never going to be the case. There was one thing, it might not be final, it's just one thing I was quite interested about the meeting management thing and about the agenda, because that's something I've been my bonus about. I haven't tried it in the arts organisations, but other places where I've had that chairing role, I've asked the board not to follow a conventional agenda at all, and so that we always take whatever we think is the key issue, that we always take that first, and that every meeting has an element of either the art or the whatever the purpose is. Now I've detected quite a lot of resistance with some of the board members I'm working with to that idea, because they like that apologies and minutes and things, but people do get kind of bogged down in.
Well, I think for me that it's repetition.
Yeah.
Repetition dulls
Yeah.
in general in work, and we don't notice things when they're repeated. We don't notice stuff in quite the same way. So for me, it's not as it's easier in some ways to go, we got this, we always do the finance first, or we do it last, but my experience is it doesn't necessarily make the best use of people's time or their attention, which is more important than their time, actually.
Yeah, some of my worst experience has also been, oh well, I know that the finance is going to be this time, or I know the bit that I'm interested in this time, so I'll turn up. I know that if I'm a bit late, it doesn't matter, I won't miss the bit that I want, or if I leave a bit early, it doesn't matter because I won't miss the bit. So I've had that. So we don't have any. Most of these I have, like the audit committee, we have themes, and we delineate the time accordingly, but it will always be different papers in different places. I don't know.
May I go back a step? Sorry, I asked a really stupid question about the observer thing. So it doesn't happen in Scotland. Does it happen in Wales and England?
It didn't.
It didn't?
And I think if you do get an observer now, because this was a few years back, but if you do get an observer now, it's usually a sign of, we think you're in trouble.
That's in
Yes.
Scotland?
Yeah.
And that's what we're moving to in Wales,
Yeah, well, at the moment we have
So
an
worry
ACW
if you
and
go
an
observer.
ACE
Great.
observer at each of our full board meetings.
You do automatically.
But not every organisation, I think, although it's probably
I
the
think
same
it's
policy,
been
it's
phased out.
a bit-
Yeah, I think it's been phased out.
And what was the thinking behind it originally?
well, it was the same sort of, for me, it was the same sort of model as you would perhaps have a local government. It was checking that people were doing things kind of properly. It was being there. It was
Leasing it?
To a certain extent, it was. Well, if you think it was a sort of proxy for the money, it followed the money. Actually,
So how is this?
because in the same way that if I put my money into a private sector company, I would expect to have a seat on the board or the right to interact with
So
the
right to transparency came
Yeah,
with
it
the
was
funding.
something of that, and then the organisations, I think, either started or developed. In certain cases, that kind of dependency that Miles was describing. I've certainly experienced that.
If I was sort of almost cynical about it, in the Arts Council in particular, the observers seemed to be a mixture of attempting to see that there was no failure looming on the horizon, but also actually trying to get a bit of the glory on the way. So that there was a kind of moment of, we put 40% of the money towards this, and goddamn, you got the money from wherever else, but we want to be seen as, which is why, you get Matilda posters on the tube, have an Arts Council logo on the corner, because it's RSC and we bloody pay for it. So I think for better, and if I'm being very cynical about that, but for better or worse, it was kind of a dual function of avoiding the absolute terrible it might happen and following the money in a bad way, but also following the money in a good way. You want to be part of the brilliance when it goes right.
Right, okay.
They're kind of, wow, isn't this fantastic?
But I'm quite intrigued, so from your point of view, that you wanted something in return for that, a level of expertise.
Well, it's not that I want something in return, it's just that the level of expertise has dropped.
So it was there,
It was there, yeah.
to something that you could ask and as a kind of source of knowledge in certain areas.
I mean, if you take our Arts Council of England representative, it would have been the director of music.
Right.
And then it dropped to senior music director for opera. And with no disrespect, it's now a relatively junior post in the West Midlands office.
And why is that?
It's a result of, firstly, devolution of the organisations to the regions in which they're based, and for us, we're not based in one of the English regions, so we ended up in Birmingham because why not? And I think then a result of 2 or 3 restructures that involve taking lots of expertise out of the organisation, out of the Arts Council of England. So
it's a pattern that I recognise from my board now when I'm on board. I mean, to be honest, it's disheartening. It's probably nearly 4 years since I left, but there are times when I cringe, if I'm absolutely honest. And that's, you know, they're good people, but they haven't got the breadth. In general, certainly in the Arts Council, I don't comment on any others, the experience with which people bring into the organisation has tended to get shorter in comparison to the last 15 years.
Because
Well,
most
if
don't want to work really.
It used to be an aspiration to work for the Arts Council.
Yeah.
It's
now-
not such a
And it's
nice
probably
job.
not anymore.
You wouldn't want to necessarily.
Why?
Because
It's not funded very well, you get beaten to death by everybody going, you're doing a
But
crap job.
why?
or, you know.
Why? What's changed? I mean, because
Well,
in the
what's changed
1970s
is
they got beaten
the
as well
number
at
of
the
jobs have shrunk and shrunk and
Yeah,
shrunk and shrunk.
45% cut in real terms is what
I-
Arts
But
Council
I
we've
think-
been
has since
through
2010.
decades of terrible cuts in the past. Do you know what I mean? So why?
My sense, this is probably a different conversation, but my sense is it's
Sorry.
a combination of numbers, but it's actually, this is purely a personal opinion, it's to do with the decision-making power that those individuals have. Those individuals that are now observers at board meetings generally don't have any decision-making power, whereas even at a regional level, previously, officer level people, or not even heads of department or managers, would have had more. So if you were the
there's a
literature officer, you would
restructuring of the
develop
Arts Council.
development.
I think, yeah.
It's to do with decision-making structures as much as
I'm
anything.
sure you. I mean, they've done
Because
that
they've
huge
been
help
through
study
funding
about stress,
things.
haven't they? That's the
Yeah.
side of your ability to
Yeah.
just decide on what you do with your time and
Yeah. So they will give you the guidance, not
yeah.
the steer.
So they're wielding
I'm
power,
gonna
which is so therefore
just-
that's attractive to people.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, because you can make stuff happen. Yeah, I think in the when I first connected to that system in the 90s from the outside, but you could make stuff happen in a department.
Yeah, I mean, I think in our case, you know, we're a touring opera company, and the English perspective, there would be the director of touring and the director of music would be jointly responsible for driving the strategy of where the Arts Council of England wanted its opera and its ballet and its
Yeah.
theatre to be.
Yes.
And now...
So this intrigues me. So sorry, this is on a high level then. So what's driving that? What's driving that change of that removal of the decision making?
Well, it is a governance issue, actually. I mean, it does come back to
that's quite
governance issue.
fundamental, I would have thought.
Because, and in England, it's to do with the centralisation of decision-making powers,
Yeah.
rather than the devolution of decision-making powers. Again, that's my analysis of it. That over the last, since 2001, that has centralised. So, and that's an interesting thing when you think about governance works at those different levels, is what, do you hold the board in one subcommittee, one executive committee of the board? You know, does the power really rest in a big organisation in your F&GP, or, you know,
Having decision makers at your board
Yeah.
is really, really critical.
And in general, I find that the more devolved decision making, whether that's devolved into the staff in certain levels or into other bits, in any governance system, the more devolved, the more diverse the inputs, and the more centralised, the harder it is to get that creativity. And you gain something, you gain simplicity, you gain control, you lose some other things.
But that's understandable when you see the budget slash that's
No, I mean, that's
cut in
what's
real
driven it.
terms. It's doing that to staff, to every level of the organisation. You have to centralise and simplify, and you lose good people as a result of that because they step out or they're pushed out, and therefore
They have different roles and responsibilities.